Something has happened that nobody thought was actually possible. Prince William has essentially pulled off a hidden power grab right inside Buckingham Palace, and his first move was to start carefully removing Queen Camilla from the royal machine, one piece at a time. This all started after a massive luxury yacht scandal exploded in the middle of summer, and trust me, the wildest part is not even the yacht itself. The absolute craziest part is how the entire thing came crashing down, not through some daring investigation or a dramatic whistleblower, but through something completely boring. It came apart because of a routine ship registry update. That's right, a boring maritime filing that exists only for insurance purposes. This is the kind of document nobody reads unless it's literally their job, and that single dull piece of paperwork started a chain reaction that is right now reshaping the entire British monarchy. This is where the real story begins, and I'm telling the truth when I say the deeper dig into the timeline, the more the official explanations completely fall apart. If this is new to the channel, hit subscribe right now so when something new happens, when we find out what happens next, when the palace makes their next move, when anything changes, the moment we get more information, the moment it breaks, the moment it's official, the moment it happens, the moment the story develops, the moment anything shifts, the moment the palace responds, the moment there's new information, you're going to be the first to know. Let me take the story back to a trip that absolutely nobody was supposed to find out about. The timing on this is almost impossible to believe. It happened in late July 2025, and when the moment comes, the contrast is everything. Picture this. While William and Catherine were stuck doing one public event after another across the entire country, they were pushing through kids' hospices in Birmingham and veteran events near Edinburgh, doing the unglamorous but beautiful work that the job requires. But here's the shocker. During that exact same time, Camilla was sitting on a super yacht parked off the southern coast of France. And this wasn't some official royal vessel. It wasn't chartered by the crown with official staff or a nice entry in the court calendar. This was a private luxury yacht registered in Malta and named Esperanza 3. It was owned through a holding company in Luxembourg and belonged to a Swiss-based businessman whose name showed up absolutely nowhere in Camilla's official schedule. His name wasn't in her public diary. His name wasn't in any palace press release across that entire summer. And here's the thing that gives it all away. No announcement was made. No royal reporters got a briefing. The palace press office, which literally documents practically every major move by a senior royal, had no record of this trip existing at all. Think about how strange that really is. This is an organization that records absolutely everything. The fact that there's no record at all is absolutely crucial. When something this massive happens and there's nothing written down anywhere, that's not an accident or a careless mistake. When a record is completely missing like that, it means someone made an active choice to keep it off the books on purpose. And once the reality of that sinks in, every innocent explanation that came after it has to somehow get over that one basic fact. Most of them just can't do it. Now, the guy who owned the yacht has never been convicted of any crime. I want to be fair about this. No authority has ever officially charged him with anything, but over the past 10 years, his name keeps popping up in multiple European lobbying disclosures. His company has active interests in land development, agricultural policy, and heritage property law. And here's the problem. Those are exactly the kinds of fields that sit uncomfortably close to the kinds of decisions that royal organizations and crown estate management can quietly influence. In other words, he is absolutely the type of person the royal family promised they would never connect with again after everything that happened with Prince Andrew. And this is where it becomes really serious. And honestly, this is the detail that changes everything and makes the whole situation make sense. Camilla had stayed on his boat before. That detail came out later, and we're going to get to it. But keep that thought because it transforms a single mistake into something that has a pattern. For right now, let's stay focused on this July trip, which lasted 5 days, and look at who was actually on the boat because the guest list reads like a complete checklist of conflicts of interest. There was someone who had given money to royal causes and who had property planning applications in the West Country waiting for approval. There was a European media executive whose company holds broadcasting contracts with businesses that receive royal endorsements. And there were at least 2 individuals whose names had appeared in leaked files from a 2023 lobbying investigation in Brussels. Not one of these people was there in any official capacity. Not one of them was on any public record. By every appearance, this was a private gathering of people who had business interests that connected to the crown, hosted on a boat that officially did not exist in Camilla's life. I keep coming back to that guest list because think about what it actually represents. Every single person on that boat wanted something that the crown in one way or another could provide. Property decisions, broadcasting contracts, heritage rulings. This wasn't a group of old friends catching up over dinner. This was at minimum a room full of people with business pending before the very institution Camilla represents. All of them enjoying 5 days of close, private, unrecorded access to the queen consort. And even if not one improper word was ever spoken, even if it was all perfectly innocent conversation over wine, the picture alone is extremely problematic, because in this world, the image is what matters. The moment it looks like access to the crown is something that can be enjoyed on a rich man's yacht, the damage is already done, whether or not a single favor was ever exchanged. And William, more than anyone else, understands that the appearance is the entire game, so here's how it all came out. And this is the part I find almost beautiful. It didn't break through a major news story. It broke through that routine ship registry update. The maritime filing almost nobody reads. That document placed the vessel at a specific marina on a specific date. A royal researcher then cross-referenced the filing against a photograph one of the guests had posted. A background shot of a dinner on deck that showed up briefly on a private Instagram account before the user thought better of it and deleted it. But someone had already saved the image, and within 48 hours, that photo was in the hands of 2 British journalists and a German outlet that had spent years mapping European lobbying networks, which meant they knew exactly what they were looking at. By the first week of August, reporters were quietly verifying the basics. By mid-August, the palace press office started getting phone calls. It was in no way prepared to answer them, and I keep coming back to how fragile the thread was. One deleted photo, one filing nobody reads. That's all it took to pull on, and the whole thing started to come loose. Now, this situation was uniquely damaging, and not just because of the vacation itself, but because of when it happened, and the context makes all the difference. For the previous 18 months, William had been pushing a very specific plan inside the palace. He wanted tighter controls on the outside relationships senior royals could keep. He wanted rules on gifts and hospitality from anyone with financial interests connected to the crown. And he wanted a clear internal order that the monarchy simply could not survive another scandal like the ones that destroyed Prince Andrew. And here's the thing, William hadn't just talked about this, he put it in writing. His team had sent the updated rules to the households of every senior royal, and this guidance was mandatory, not a polite suggestion. Camilla's office received that document and she went on the trip anyway. Stop and think about what that means. This wasn't a woman who didn't know the rules. This was a woman who had the new rules in her own office and stepped straight over them. Royal sources spoke to the Times in August and described the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace as one of controlled fury. And if the understanding of how William actually operates is there, that phrase should chill the person far more than any story about shouting ever could. Because William doesn't yell, he doesn't leak to the press, he doesn't grant interviews to explain his side. What he does is remove people. He removed his own brother from the royal institution. He removed Camilla's own sister, Annabelle Elliot, from the Duchy of Cornwall payroll without a single public word. He forced Prince Andrew out of Royal Lodge through a process so patient and so methodical that by the time it was finished, Andrew had no cards left to play. And everyone who knows William says the same thing about him every time. When he decides something is over, it is completely over. The announcement, if it ever comes at all, is just paperwork catching up to a decision he made long ago. So by late August, the question inside palace circles was never whether William would act. It was only how and how fast. But before we get to his reaction, there's a detail we have to stop on because it changes the entire shape of the story. Who told him? Because William didn't learn about this from the news. He knew before journalists had even started making their first calls. Someone inside that. Small circle who knew about the trip, a guest, a staffer, someone connected to the owner made sure the details went straight to Kensington Palace. And in this world, that is not just a leak. That is a warning. It means at least one person who was there or close to there believed that whatever happened on that boat was wrong enough to hand directly to the future king, which tells one thing: William had a source deep inside the circle. And honestly, that reframes everything that follows because it proves the scandal never caught him by surprise. Somebody deliberately placed the information in his hands to make him act. And he did. And I want to sit with what that source actually means, because it's easy to skate past. Somebody who was trusted enough to be in that world, close enough to know the details, looked at what was happening and made a choice. Not to go to the press for money, not to sit on it quietly and protect their own position, but to send it straight to the future king. And the reason the person would do that is simple. The reason is that this person had already decided which way the wind was blowing. The reason is that on some level, this person concluded that William is where the real power now lives, and that being the person who warned him is a safer place to stand than being the person who stayed silent. So the tip-off isn't just a piece of information, it's a data point about the whole institution. It tells the truth, that people on the inside are already quietly reorganizing themselves around William, already treating him as the center of gravity, already making their small private bets on the future. And that shift, that quiet repositioning of loyalties was happening before a single engagement ever got reassigned. The staff felt the change coming before Camilla did. Now, let's talk about the paper trail, because this is where Camilla's story really comes apart. The Esperanza 3 is registered in Malta, carries a Maltese maritime license, and is owned through a Luxembourg holding company. That structure, island registration, plus a continental holding company is common enough for luxury vessels, but it also makes financial transparency extremely difficult. And that is the whole problem here, because nobody has clearly answered the one question that matters: who actually paid for Camilla's time on board? Because when royals accept private travel or hospitality from outside individuals, they are supposed to declare it. There is a specific system for exactly this. Senior royals who receive gifts, travel, or lodging above a certain value must report it through internal palace channels, and those reports feed into annual transparency records that senior household officials review. And Camilla's July trip appears in none of them, not one. The holding company that owns the Esperanza 3 is registered in Luxembourg as Verlaine Capital Partners with 3 listed directors, and one of them is a British citizen who was named in a 2022 Parliamentary Committee report on foreign influence in UK property markets. Now, the report did not accuse him of a crime, but it did say his firm's lobbying around heritage land decisions deserved closer scrutiny. And this matters because heritage land decisions are exactly the arena where royal support carries genuine weight. The King's Foundation, which Charles spent decades building and which Camilla is publicly linked to, weighs in on precisely those kinds of choices. Is that definitive proof of wrongdoing? No, but it is significant, and it is the kind of significant that the palace's own new rules were written to prevent. And this is where Camilla's team made things worse, because when the questions came, the answer that came back was essentially that private travel is a personal matter. And here's the problem with that line: it works fine for a holiday. A royal pays for themselves with no outside financial strings. It falls apart completely when the trip is hosted by someone whose company has a clear financial link to royal charities. At that point, it stops being a private matter and becomes a conflict of interest, which is the exact thing the palace's rules exist to stop. So that answer landed very badly inside Kensington Palace, and William's office challenged it within days. A source described the pushback as direct, meaning no diplomatic softening, no going through assistance. The message was blunt. Calling this a private matter was unacceptable, and a full account of the trip's financing was to be handed to the king's senior officials immediately. And as of this reporting, that information had not come. And then it got more complicated because this was not the first time. 3 palace sources confirmed to 2 different publications that Camilla had accepted hospitality from the same yacht owner before, during a long weekend in the summer of 2023. That trip was also kept quiet, also left off the transparency records. And here's the part that should make the person lean in. One senior official noticed that earlier trip at the time. There was a quiet conversation, nothing formal was recorded, and the matter was dropped. William did not know about it then, he knows about it now. And that single fact changes the entire character of the story, does it not? Because what first looked like one mistake is suddenly a pattern that was flagged once and then buried. And the same man hosted Camilla again 2 years later after making financial contributions to royal structures. When the pieces line up like that, they stop looking like coincidence. And William's team did line them up because the key document for them was not the port list at all. It was the charity accounts. They cross-referenced a £40,000 donation from Verlaine Capital Partners against the dates of both yacht trips. Then they checked it against a 2024 planning application submitted by a branch of that same holding company for a heritage site in Somerset. The application was rejected, but here's the detail that matters. It was reviewed by a body that included advisors appointed by the royals. Now, nobody is saying Camilla stepped in to influence the outcome, and I want to be careful there, but the appearance of a close relationship with a businessman seeking decisions from bodies linked to her own network is exactly precisely the thing the palace had promised the public it would stop. So by late August, William's team could see this was no longer a story about a yacht. It was a failure of palace governance, and that left everyone circling the one question nobody inside the building wanted to ask out loud. Did Charles know the meeting that changed everything happened on a Tuesday, the first week of September 2025, and every single detail of it was a signal? It was held at Kensington Palace, William's own residence, rather than at Buckingham Palace, the King's. And that choice alone sends a message before anyone says a word. 3 senior advisors attended: William's private secretary, his communications secretary, and one official from the king's household who had been ordered to attend rather than invited. Ordered. And nobody in that room missed the weight of that word. William brought a physical folder, printed documents, not a screen. Inside were the charity financial statements, the port logs, the 2022 lobbying disclosures, and a single-page summary of the 2023 trip, the earlier journey that had been quietly noted and then hidden away by an official who should have passed it up the chain. William set the folder on the table and left it there. He didn't walk them through it. He didn't describe the contents. He simply said he needed to know who saw this in 2023 and decided it didn't need to go any further. And think about the theater of that for a second, because it's deliberate. He could have emailed the documents. He could have had an aide summarize them. Instead, he printed them, put them in a physical folder, carried them into a room in his own house, and let them sit there closed on the table while he asked his questions. The folder was the point. It was a physical object that said, this is real, this is documented, this is not going away, and I have it. In an institution that runs on the unrecorded word and the quiet understanding, William walked in with paper, and everyone in that room understood the message underneath the message. The era of things being handled with a discreet conversation and no notes was over, and the official from the king's household, a man with more than 15 years of palace experience, couldn't give a clear answer. He knew the earlier trip had been flagged. He didn't know who had decided to keep it off the record, and that vagueness did not satisfy William, and he let that be felt. According to a source with direct knowledge of the meeting, what followed was not a shouting match. It was quieter than that, and far more uncomfortable. William walked through the paper trail step by step. The first trip, the donation, the planning application, the second trip. He laid them out in chronological order, and then he asked one simple question: at what point was my father informed? And the answer, it turned out, was complicated in the worst possible way. Charles had been told about the July trip, but only as a casual update, not a formal disclosure. He knew about it the way a husband knows his wife is going on a holiday. The location, the rough dates, that she was traveling with friends. He had not been told who owned the yacht. He didn't know about the Luxembourg holding company, the lobbying history, or the donation. Whether he ever thought to ask is a separate question, and it's one nobody in that room was willing to answer out loud. William sat in silence for a moment. Then he said the king didn't know because the system had failed to protect the right things. And then he made 3 specific demands. First, a full written disclosure of both trips to the king's principal private secretary within 7 days. Second, a full review of Camilla's patronages to check for links to outside donors. Third, an immediate suspension of all contact between Camilla's household and the yacht owner. and Camilla pushed back on that last demand through Charles. The king called William the next day and argued that Camilla had never intended to deceive anyone and that a formal review would only leak. And William's answer, I think, tells the truth about where power actually sits in that building now. He told his father plainly that the story was already out and the palace could either manage the situation or be destroyed by it. Charles didn't agree right away, but he didn't tell William to stop either. And by the end of the week, when Camilla's office sent a partial disclosure, William's team rejected it immediately as incomplete. A future king's office formally rejecting the queen consort's office. That has no modern precedent. None. A stalemate set in with Camilla's people, providing only the bare minimum. And then the stalemate broke hard when a new piece of information surfaced from inside the palace. One of the yacht guests had held an unlogged meeting in London with a member of Camilla's patronage advisory board just 6 weeks before the trip. Now, let me show the first time any of this became visible from the outside because it's such a small thing that almost everyone missed it. There's a photograph from September 12th, 2025 of Charles arriving at a film premiere in London completely alone. Camilla had been on the original program. She wasn't there. The official reason was a scheduling conflict, no further detail, and royal correspondents noted it and moved on, and most people thought nothing of it. But inside the palace, that absence was not a scheduling conflict. It was the first visible crack, the first outward sign that something had shifted in how Camilla's public commitments were being managed and who was now doing the managing. And to understand why that shift was even possible, the topic that the palace never quite says out loud has to be discussed. Charles has been in cancer treatment since February 2024. He hasn't discussed the specifics beyond that initial statement, but what's known from palace sources and medical correspondence is that his treatment has forced real changes to his working pattern. Engagements reduced, overseas travel limited, days when he simply isn't well enough to be in the room. And that physical reality has quietly rearranged the balance of power inside the palace in a way no announcement has ever formally acknowledged. Because think about the mechanics of it. When the king isn't well enough to chair a discussion, someone else chairs it. When he can't review a document, someone else reviews it. And across 2024 and into 2025, that someone with increasing regularity has been William. This isn't a coup in the dramatic sense. It's just what happens in any institution when the person at the top is managing a serious illness and has a capable, willing deputy ready to absorb the load. But it does mean that by the time the yacht story broke, Charles's ability to step in and shield Camilla was already far more limited than it had been 2 years earlier. Not because he'd lost the title, but because the day-to-day gravity of the institution had already been shifting toward William for months, and everyone inside knew it. So that phone call Charles made, the one where he argued the review would only become a bigger story, that was a genuinely hard call for him to make. Charles does not find confrontation with his son easy. Their relationship was carefully rebuilt over the years after the worst of the Diana era fallout, and he has put real effort into it, and he loves Camilla deeply. He spent 30 years being publicly criticized for that relationship, and he married her when doing so was still a real risk to the institution itself. His commitment to her is not in question, and I do not want anyone to hear this and think it is. So when William told him the partial disclosure was insufficient and the review would proceed regardless, Charles pushed back again. He reportedly told William that Camilla had given him her word there was nothing in the 2023 trip that needed further scrutiny, and William told his father flatly that her word did not match the documentation. And I want the understanding of that exchange to sink in because it is extraordinary. A son telling his father, the reigning king, that a personal assurance from the king's own wife is not good enough, and the king not being in a position to simply end the conversation with a firm refusal. Charles asked for more time. William gave him 72 hours. Those 72 hours were some of the most strained the household has been through. Charles spoke to Camilla. Camilla spoke to her advisors. Her advisors spoke to palace lawyers. And at some point, the question of that 2023 meeting between the yacht guest and her patronage board member was put directly to Camilla, and her answer was that she hadn't been at that meeting and hadn't known it took place. place. Now, that may be completely true, but look at the problem it creates because it's a trap either way. If she didn't know it happened, then someone in her own circle arranged a meeting between one of her patronage advisors and a man who would later host her on a yacht and didn't tell her. So either her own staff were managing her without her knowledge, or the meeting wasn't considered important enough to mention to her. And honestly, neither of those is a comfortable thing for Charles to have to defend. Both of them make the picture worse, not better. By the end of those 72 hours, Charles had arrived at a place no husband ever wants to reach. He couldn't contradict William's factual case because the documents existed and the meeting had happened. He couldn't independently verify Camilla's account because the relevant staffer had only given a partial explanation. And he couldn't tell William to drop the review without openly undermining the institutional reform agenda that he, Charles, had himself publicly endorsed. He called William on the Thursday evening. The conversation was shorter than the first. He told William to proceed, asked that Camilla be treated with dignity throughout, and requested that nothing go public without his prior knowledge. William agreed to the last two. The review, it turned out, was already underway before the call even ended. And here's the thing Charles couldn't bring himself to say out loud, but that every senior official understood by then. He had just stopped being able to protect her. The space where his protection used to operate had quietly closed around him while he was focused on staying well enough to keep working. Camilla had built her entire security inside this institution on Charles's ability to shield her. And that shield had just developed a crack far too wide to patch. So what does removal actually look like in a place like this? Because it's worth understanding since it's happening in plain sight. Camilla's autumn schedule, as drafted by her household back in July, had 14 solo engagements between October and December. Patronage visits, charity dinners, the opening of a hospital in Cardiff, 2 literary events for her reading initiative, a keynote at a women's leadership conference in Edinburgh. And by the end of September, 6 of those had been quietly reassigned, not cancelled, notice the word, reassigned. They were handed to a different royal for the same date and the same event. The organizations were told it was down to scheduling pressures and nothing more was offered. And nobody asked questions publicly because that's not how the person stays on good terms with the palace. But the royal correspondents noticed instantly, and so did Camilla's own staff, because this is exactly how removal works inside a royal institution. It doesn't arrive with a statement or a scene. It arrives through a diary that keeps getting shorter, through briefing documents that stop landing on the desk, through meetings that start happening without the person. The entire machinery of royal life runs on access to information, to events, to the people who make decisions. And when that access shrinks, the influence shrinks with it quietly and completely. Staff start to sense their futures are no longer tied to the office. And the power shift finishes without a single word ever being spoken. William didn't need to issue a statement about Camilla. He just needed the diary to do the talking. And the staffing changes came in 2 phases, which is its own tell. In early October, 2 senior members of Camilla's team, her deputy private secretary and a senior communications advisor, were told their roles were being restructured as part of a palace efficiency review. Both took alternative positions in the wider household. Neither was replaced. The second phase was quieter. 3 junior staff redeployed by the end of October. And so Camilla's dedicated team went from 11 people at the start of 2025 to just 7 by November. At the same time, her access to information narrowed. Senior royals received regular private briefing documents, foreign policy, domestic politics, institutional matters, and Camilla had received a broad selection since the coronation. But from October, her distribution was cut back. Foreign policy briefings stopped. Unrelated institutional briefings stopped. She went from being kept informed as a matter of course to a strict need-to-know basis. And that more than the diary is how the situation can be measured. Information is the currency in that building, and hers was being quietly devalued. And here's why that matters more than it might sound. Being in the room, being on the distribution list, knowing what's coming before it is public, that isn't a perk. It's the entire basis of a senior royal's influence. It's how the shaping of things happens, how the person gets consulted, how the opinion becomes something that has to be managed. Take that away and the title stays exactly the same while the substance underneath it hollows out. The person becomes someone who finds out what the family decided at the same time as everyone else. And for a woman who spent decades earning her way into those rooms, being quietly shown the door of them without anyone ever actually saying the words is its own particular kind of message. And Catherine's role in this transition has been unmistakable. She took over the Edinburgh Women's Leadership Conference and 2 of the charity dinners that had originally been Camilla's. And here's the detail that gives it away. Catherine's office confirmed her attendance within a week of the reassignments, which strongly suggests her team knew the slots were opening before Camilla's team had even finished processing the change. That's not reactive, that's coordinated. It let Catherine step smoothly into the spaces Camilla used to occupy, keeping continuity for the organizations, and quietly making the substitution look natural. And there's one more detail from late October that shows how complete the shift really is. William and Catherine spent a weekend with Charles at Highgrove, his private country home in Gloucestershire. Camilla stayed at Clarence House in London. Palace sources called it an informal family weekend, but the fact that Charles, William, and Catherine spent that time together without Camilla was noted very carefully inside the palace, because these things are never really informal at that level. So let's be honest about where that leaves her. Camilla still holds her title. She still appears beside Charles at state occasions. On paper, she is still queen consort, but the diary is thinner, the staff is smaller, the briefings are limited, and the woman filling her spaces is Catherine. And here's the truth of it. The person doesn't need a formal decree to change someone's position. The person just changes everything around them until they can feel the difference. And she can feel it. Now, in November 2025, William gave a private speech to a group of senior civil servants working on public sector reform. Closed to the press, no transcript ever released. But 2 people who were there later described it to journalists. And what they reported wasn't the careful hedged language the person would expect from a future king guarding his image. William told the room plainly that institutions which protect individuals at the expense of their own integrity do not survive. He didn't point at anything. He didn't name anyone. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room already knew exactly what had been unfolding inside the palace over the previous 3 months. And that one line, I think, is the clearest window we have into how he actually thinks. Because to understand why his reform agenda isn't just talk, the examination of what William already controls is necessary. The Duchy of Cornwall generates roughly £30 million a year and spans 135,000 acres across England, the Isles of Scilly, and major financial holdings. William has run that estate since September 2022 when Charles became king, and in less than 4 years, he's replaced outside contractors, restructured the management team, and cut every arrangement that ran on personal trust rather than a written agreement. And that last point is the whole key to this man. Undocumented arrangements built on personal trust. That is precisely what happened on that yacht. William didn't arrive at his hardline on governance by accident. He built it over years of running a £1 billion estate, and he proved it worked there before he ever applied it to Camilla. The Royal Foundation is the same story. A chief executive published annual accounts, clear goals, and when a program fails to deliver, it's cut. One former advisor said William runs it like a man who has been burned by secrecy before, and now believes documentation is the only real protection. And that's not a personality quirk. That's a system built deliberately after watching his own family damage itself over and over through informal, unrecorded arrangements. And here's the deeper current running under all of it. The thing that can't be left out of this story because it's the engine of the whole man. William was 15 years old when his mother died. He walked behind Diana's coffin while the world watched. And the machine that failed to protect Diana, the informal understandings, the things that happened off the record, the institution protecting itself over the people inside it. That is the exact machine William has spent his adult life trying to dismantle. So when he looks at a secret yacht, an undeclared donation, a meeting nobody logged, he isn't just seeing a governance failure. On some level, he is seeing the same shape that swallowed his mother, and I don't think the understanding of why he moved this decisively against his own fathers. Life is possible without understanding that. This was never only about Camilla. Underneath it has always been about Diana and about a boy who decided a long time ago that this would never happen on his watch. William has been very clear about the monarchy he intends to build. Fewer working royals, tighter control over who represents the crown, zero tolerance for outside financial relationships that even look like conflicts of interest. And the yacht scandal simply handed him the justification and the momentum to accelerate all of it. The shrinking is already happening. Andrew gone, Harry gone, extended family who used to handle regional events quietly phased out. The public face of the monarchy now is essentially William, Catherine, Charles, and Anne. A smaller group is far easier to control. Fewer risks, fewer informal informal relationships, fewer secret trips, and Catherine's place in that new structure has changed dramatically. She came back to full public duties in early 2025 after her cancer treatment and immediately took on a heavy load, her office now handling major coordination, attending strategy meetings that traditionally wouldn't have included a Princess of Wales. One source called her a co-strategist rather than a supporting spouse. William trusts her judgment above anyone else's, which makes her, in practical terms, the second most powerful person in the institution. And against that backdrop, here's what has to be understood about Camilla's reduced role. It isn't just a temporary punishment for one trip. The monarchy William is building has a new center of gravity, and she simply is not part of it. The engagements shifted to Catherine are not coming back. The staff cuts are not being reversed. And that leaves the one question palace officials will not touch. When Charles dies, Camilla becomes Queen Dowager. She keeps the title and a residence, but the major estates, Sandringham, Balmoral, pass to William. Almost all the institutional support she leans on exists because Charles is king. When that changes, her whole quality of life inside the institution will depend more or less entirely on William's generosity. And given everything that has just happened, how much of that is coming? And I want the understanding of the position she's in to sink in because it's genuinely precarious in a way that's easy to underestimate. Everything Camilla has, the title, the staff, the residences, the standing, has always been downstream of one thing and one thing only: Charles being on the throne and being willing to use his authority to shelter her. That was the deal, unspoken but total, and it worked for years because Charles was both willing and able. But the yacht scandal exposed something she may not have fully reckoned with until it was happening to her. The willing part was never in doubt. It was the able part that quietly failed. A king in active cancer treatment, focused on conserving his energy for the duties he can still perform, is simply not in a position to fight a prolonged internal battle on his wife's behalf against a son who holds every document and every advantage. And once that truth is seen, the reason why William didn't need to be cruel or loud or public becomes clear. He just needed to wait for the protection to thin and then move through the gap. The whole thing is almost clinical, and here's the part that I think makes this a genuine tragedy rather than just a power story, because I don't want to lose sight of the human being at the center of it. Camilla did something almost nobody believed was actually possible. She walked into public life as the most resented woman in Britain, tied in the public mind to the collapse of the most beloved marriage of a generation. And over 30 years, she rehabilitated herself into a queen consort the country had more or less come to accept. That took extraordinary patience and discipline. She earned a place that once looked impossible. And now, because of a 5-day trip and a filing nobody was supposed to read, she is watching that place quietly contract around her. Engagement by engagement, briefing by briefing, staffer by staffer. Not taken in one dramatic blow, which she might have been able to fight, but drained slowly in a way that leaves nothing to push against. And the man doing the draining isn't even angry with her? Not really, he's just building something she doesn't fit into. So watch what happens next, because this is far from over. The real test isn't the autumn diary or the staff cuts. Those are already settled. The real test is whether Camilla accepts this new, smaller shape, or whether she tries to fight her way back. Because the moment she genuinely pushes, she forces the one confrontation everyone has been carefully avoiding. The one where Charles has to choose out loud between his wife and his heir's vision of the future. And here's what I keep thinking: William has almost certainly already gamed that out. He's not a man who moves without knowing how the board resolves 3 steps ahead, which means if Camilla pushes and he pushes, she may simply be walking into the next room he's already prepared for her. The question is whether she can see that, or whether the instinct to fight for the position she spent 30 years building is stronger than the strategist's patience she'd need to survive. So here's where it all stands. Camilla still has her title. She still walks beside Charles at state occasions. But the diary is thinner. The staff is fewer. And the woman filling her spaces is Catherine. And I'll leave with the 3 questions nobody inside that palace is willing to answer right now. Did Camilla genuinely not understand the risk she was taking? A woman that experienced with the new rules sitting in her own office. Is William right to move this decisively, or is he building a monarchy so tightly controlled that it leaves no room at all for human error? And when Charles is gone, will William extend the generosity Camilla is going to desperately need from a man who has never forgotten whose shadow hangs over his childhood? Tell me what the thinking is down below, and if the moment comes when the next piece of this surfaces, and it will, make absolutely sure to stay subscribed. Thanks for watching.